So we said, okay, let's talk about mitigation. So that was one reason why adaptation was, in fact adaptation has been mentioned only 4 to 6 times, that's it. What has been mentioned around 14 times, if I remember correctly, was adverse effects of climate change. And that was also in the context of increasing action on mitigation. So the entire document largely focuses on mitigation because we were pretty hopeful we'll be able to deal with the problem, but we have failed very clearly. We didn't do enough that time. Developed countries are responsible, and that's why several years later, and as Sanjay said, in 2001 we got this IPCC report where it was realized that a lot more needed to be done in the field of adaptation. Even developing countries were not very convinced that we should be working on adaptation back then. For two reasons. One, science wasn't very clear, science about all the different impacts of climate change, and second, they thought politically, if we start talking about adaptation, then there will be less pressure on mitigation. That was another reason even developing countries were not willing to focus a lot on adaptation, which was quite justified at that point in time. But now it's clear. In fact, way back in 2001, they said adaptation and mitigation are two sides of the same coin. So you need to work on both the aspects together, and there is no harm in working on adaptation. It will not jeopardize our focus on mitigation. That's all. So that's why adaptation science, adaptation actions have been lagging behind, and we have been calling it a poor cousin of climate action. Now adaptation meant that we are far more prepared in dealing with the impacts. Now which means, and if I elaborate the actions, and I think for a state government it's really important to understand the components, and Dr. Satpathy has been highlighting, it's about the additionality of actions that we have to take to prevent us and ecosystems and our properties from the impacts of climate change, which means things that we need to do before climate impacts hit us, and that's a very important distinction when we speak about adaptation and loss and damage. So whatever you do before impacts hit you is about preparing, and that's where the connection with disaster risk reduction comes in, and Professor Sharma will talk more about in detail. That how we prepare, if it means about early warning systems, it's about dikes, it's about climate resilient agriculture, it's about seeds, all that. But unfortunately in the last few years we have realized that we have already reached a stage where impacts are going to be overwhelming. Many countries, many states that are traditionally prepared to deal with climate impacts are being overwhelmed by the intensity and frequency of disasters that we are facing in the last few years. Just imagine in 2016, drought affected over 33 crore people. And I think that figure was revised again, and that's the Government of India figure I'm talking about. So that's the scale of impacts we are talking about. Rajasthan is flooded and Assam declares drought. So look at what's really happening, and that we have been seeing in the last few years. So which means that it's going beyond our capacity, and that's where we start talking about loss and damage. So now there are three pillars of climate action. Mitigation, traditionally that's what we have been working on. Adaptation, which means preparing well in advance before it hits you. And third, what happens when it actually hits you. And that requires a totally different set of actions, and that's where relief and rehabilitation and reconstruction, all those aspects that we generally talk about in the field of emergency response, humanitarian response, that's where it starts really connecting with that. So I think the recognition of loss and damage came for the first time beyond adaptation. That happened in 2015, and that's why the slide that Sanjay was showing that climate damage became a separate pillar. So starting with adaptation, recognized properly in Marrakesh Accord in 2001, it became one of the building blocks in 2007 as part of Bali Action Plan. It started getting recognized under fast start financing and long-term financing discussions in 2009. Sir was talking about the anti-adaptation framework. That's where it became a lot more holistic, because number of things. That's where we started talking about national adaptation plans, which are more for medium to long term. In 2001, we talked about national programs of action for urgent and immediate action, and largely focusing on least developed countries. Whereas NAPs are applicable across. In fact, developed countries are also now preparing their plans in one way or the other. They may not be naming using the same nomenclature, but overall they are now working on their adaptation plans. Adaptation Committee got established in 2011. We started talking about support, and that's where Doha Climate Gateway mentioned a lot more on adaptation in 2012, and it became a separate article, and a global goal on adaptation was agreed, which is again on mitigation, as Sanjay was saying, 2 degree, 1.5 degree, but what about the goal on adaptation? Now, these are different fruits. You can't compare adaptation with mitigation. So you can't have same set of indices, but these are two different fruits, but need to be in the same basket. Which means that you need to have a goal on adaptation, and it is still being unpacked because it can't be completely quantitative. It's about keeping people safe. Now you can't have all quantitative indicators around it. You need to have qualitative ones as well, and that's why that's what was agreed. And there's also a committee on capacity building that was agreed, and which will also look into adaptation, and that's where most of the capacity building aspect is required. So that's what happened in Paris Agreement. So we now have adaptation very strongly on the agenda, and even Green Climate Fund, as we speak, is really struggling, in fact, because of the subjectivity involved in adaptation. It is struggling to define what adaptation means, and two of the projects, one from Ethiopia and another from Bangladesh, was put on hold. One was rejected, one was put on hold, and that created so much of noise from developing countries on how do you really fund under Green Climate Fund for adaptation. So in fact, they are now having a consultation on 5th and 6th of March in Sombo at the GCF Secretariat, where they are going to be discussing which elements to really look into when it comes to adaptation financing. In fact, I have been invited to be part of that. There are going to be 30 international experts really going deep into that area. And that's where really examples from all the work that you're doing would be quite helpful. Now, going slightly more into Paris outcome, as I said, there's a global goal on adaptation that looks into adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability. If you read the article, it links mitigation and finance, and that's an extremely important aspect. The goal on adaptation cannot be static. Why? Because it depends on the kind of mitigation actions you are taking, or how much we are really achieving on mitigation. If the temperature rise, as it stands today, is already more than 1 degree Celsius, and that's why we are seeing so many impacts on the ground. If it crosses 1.5, we'll see many more impacts. That means it will have a clear bearing on the kind of preparations you have to do to adapt. If it goes beyond 2 degrees, it's going to be devastating. So your adaptation action or your goal has to be linked with what's really happening on mitigation. So it can't be static. And that connection is there, that language is there, and we need to really unpack that and put pressure on the international system to do more on mitigation. And if we are not achieving the target, how you need more finance and more actions on adaptation. So that linkage is very much there. Differentiation, Sanjay already talked about. That's where also it mentions about particularly vulnerable countries who need more support. Adaptation reporting is part of it, which is again very important. If it is not part of reporting, then countries are not talking about it, then it doesn't become a real priority at the international level. The challenge is that the reference to finance is not as strong as they wanted it to be. So that fight continues, and that's why we are really struggling when there is a roadmap to $100 billion. The adaptation share is just 20%. So that fight has to continue.
Now, who will finance how much? That is also not clear. 100 billion is for all.
Exactly. Well, that's not clear. So developed countries submitted a report in 2016 at the Marrakesh COP. There was another COP in Marrakesh, and they have just put together a figure, and it has basically bossed up numbers, and they've used double counting. They've even used added loan under $100 billion. Loan money has to go back to them, but they still counted that.
That was 62 billion.
Yeah, exactly. So they say that they will be able to achieve $100 billion. So they are not saying which country will provide how much. That's one. That information is missing. And second, on adaptation, it's not really adequate, as I said. Only 27.
There is understanding 50-50%.
Understanding what exactly? That understanding is there.
It's not the price.
And even GCF document talks about it. But then that fight is still on because the targets are not reaching. And the reason that will always remain a challenge, because it's for adaptation, you will not be able to raise a lot of money from private sector. So That means the calculation will be of public funding, which means it's far more concrete. You can count the dollars and pounds traveling. Whereas in markets, you can clearly say, trillions have been raised, so that target is over. But on adaptation, you can map. So what next? Adaptation, communication, that discussion is happening. Communication means about reporting, about global stocktake, and the NAP process is happening. So the national adaptation plans are being prepared by several countries, mainly least developed countries who are taking the lead. Adaptation institutional arrangement is being reviewed right now because there are several institutions that came along the way in the last 16, 17 years. So how they should interact with each other, the review is going to happen in 2018. Adaptation fund. So one of the outputs that came from Kyoto Protocol was adaptation fund. And because it survives on 2% levy on clean development mechanism. So there was a connection there. But now because Kyoto Protocol is going to be dying next year, so what would happen to adaptation fund? So that discussion has been happening. Thankfully, in the last COP in November, adaptation fund has survived. It's going to be there, but a lot more process will happen this year about how adaptation fund can continue to get funding. And the global stocktake is going to happen in 2023, where adaptation is going to be there. So that's broadly about adaptation and how it has evolved and where it is and what we really need to be engaging with. I'll do a quick thing on loss and damage as well. I've already explained what loss and damage is, the third pillar now. Interestingly, there is no agreed definition on loss and damage. And loss and damage has been an extremely contentious subject at the international level. Why? Because of the question of unlimited liability. And that's what scared developed countries. They were not even engaging with the discussion on loss and damage. It was only in the Cancun where the US agreed that, okay, let's do some work on loss and damage, and eventually it came back to Paris Agreement as a separate article. But because of that fear of unlimited liability, they've actually included a clause in another decision document where it says that it cannot become a basis for liability and compensation. Anyway, that's a very long discussion required on that, so I'll not go deep into it. But broadly, what we are talking about is extreme weather events, hurricane floods, and slow onset events as well. So glacial retreat and sea level rise and increasing temperatures, ocean acidification, some of these challenges we are not even talking about. And I think that's where it makes the whole issue of loss and damage extremely important. I'll give you one example. If oceans become far more acidic, all our fisheries sector is going to get affected. And if sea level is rising, all the infrastructure development that we are doing on our coast is going to get submerged. Are we really doing that kind of analysis while building our infrastructure on the coast? Not really. We know how we do environment impact assessment. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the reality. So imagine sea level rise, which is a little more futuristic issue. So how do we really start integrating, as you very rightly said, sir, in your presentation, now it's about climate resilient development. How are we going to make our development resilient? And that's where we need to be looking into our future threats, and probably they are now current threats and not future anymore. Again, the trajectory is going to be there in you, so I'm not going to get into details. The issue came up in 1991 when Vanuatu raised it, and as I said, it didn't survive in the convention document except a weak reference to insurance somewhere. In 2007, it was highlighted as loss and damage. 2008, Alliance of Island Development, small island states actually brought it up much more strongly. 2010 in Cancun, where a work program was agreed. It was elaborated in Durban. In Doha, actually it became a big issue where developing countries said we need a decision on it, we need a body, and it was established in 2013. And then now in Paris Agreement, we have it as a separate clause which talks about averting, minimizing and addressing loss and damage. And it also talks about enhancing understanding, action and support means finance, which is a very live issue at this moment. And it talks about early warning systems. There's a bit of overlap between loss and damage and adaptation, and we cannot really do away with that, but that's fine. But it does talk about irreversible and permanent loss and damage. This is extremely important. If islands are going to be sinking, what we really do about loss and damage, who's going to be covering the cost of that, It talks about non-economic losses, which means not everything can be monetized. If I am displaced, if I have to move away from the burial sites, my temples, churches, mosques, what will really happen to my emotional self if I'm displaced, if I'm kept away from all my from the ecosystem I'm part of. So it is becoming a big issue. It will be really good for.
Can you please elaborate that climate risk pooling?
This is all about insurance. So there are different tools that are defined as risk transfer, risk pooling, and insurance.
Between the different countries?
Different countries, it could be different people as well. You know, there are people who say, okay, we all will pool some amount, and then whoever gets affected can access that. So it's a concept. It can be operationalized at all different levels, from local to international. But you're right. Different countries can come together. So in Paris outcome, as I said, I think I've covered all that. There's a body that is recognized, that was there before Paris, but now it's very much going to be alive, called Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. Some of us follow negotiations under that very, very closely. There's an expert group on non-economic losses. Again, I talked about it. So what's happening right now? So this clearinghouse was established in the last COP in November. Unfortunately, it's just between clients and companies, and there's so much focus on insurance. So if you talk about sea level rise, insurance doesn't work. If you talk about ocean acidification, it doesn't work. Insurance is about probability. So it's going to be eventually covering only a tiny amount of impact. Displacement has become a very important issue again at negotiations, because if we are going to be losing land to sea, or some land is going to be completely unusable, then displacement is going to happen. So there is a report that's going to be coming up in mid-2018, this year. Loss and damage finance, it became a very big issue again in November last year. So it was agreed that an expert dialogue will be organized in April and May, and that discussion is on. And then of course adaptation finance also needs to be scaled up. Just to tell you, recently in December, I was in Sundarbans, the Indian side of Sundarbans, where we could see impact. So what we are talking about, that's why I said it's not a future issue anymore. And we have seen how Sundarbans is really getting the wrath of climate change. If you know, houses have been destroyed. This is Maushuni Islands, where a visit was organized by journalists, and that's where we were really looking into what's happening, what government has done, and what is required. And hundreds of families were already displaced. And in fact, this embankment that you can see is just a few remains. This is the 7th embankment that was built, and it's almost now getting swallowed. So sea level rise is a reality. We're talking about loss and damage where people are getting displaced. And governments still have not been able to really understand the issue. And I think now the responsibility lies with you to understand, unpack, and if I have to put it in a few bullets, again sir was talking about it, I think the first step would be in mapping of impacts, sectoral as well as spatial, and looking into sections of society. So people living on the seashore are going to be a lot more affected. How do we understand women are going to be more affected, children, elderly people? Now there are many families who we talk to, youth have migrated, elders are left behind with no source of income, and they're barely surviving on the money transfer, which is not enough. Then what we have to do is to project impacts based on temperature rise scenarios. I don't hear much about it, and I would like to lay emphasis on that. We have to talk about impacts, but talk about future. As I was saying, connecting it with what we're really achieving on mitigation. If temperature is rising, impacts are going to be rising. So our plans have to be dynamic, looking into that, and we need to it's going to be an iterative process. And that has to talk about, so similarly, migration and displacement are going to be in line with that. More sea level rise, more land getting swallowed, more people getting displaced, and everything is linked to temperature rise. And then we have to develop resilience building plans, sectoral plans, spatial plans, population-wise, demographic, and then the measures to address loss and damage. So on one hand, we have to look into adaptation and preparing well before, but what happens when people are going to be displaced and are going to get affected by disaster. And of course, all that will require policy review, whether current policies are enough or not, what new policies and what changes need to be made, what new policies are required, and how are we implementing. So we have a huge, huge task. I know it's very disappointing to see the kind of new challenges. While we have not overcome the challenges of poverty, we have some new challenges in front of us, but that's the reality and we have to really deal with them. Thank you.